and welcome to the Moonshine Jesus Show. We're so glad y'all are here with us. I'm Mark Sandlin, and this is my buddy Caleb. How you doing, Caleb?
I'm great today, Mark. Can't wait to talk
I
about
have
paper girls.
Absolutely. Me too. Me too. Before we get into that, though, we want to remind everybody that we are sponsored by progressivechristianity.org. If you haven't checked them out yet, I suggest as soon as this show is over, you go do that. There are 6,600 pieces of progressive Christian resources and material there. I think that you will find it very useful. We also want to ask you to make sure you check out the Moonshine Jesus Show, particularly our Facebook page, as well as any place you get your podcast, you can find our broadcast. So please go and get that. And finally, a warning. This is and always will be a spoiler-full show. So don't expect to hear anything that's spoiler-free. We're going to dig deep into this show and have a good time talking about it. But before we go that far, we're going to enjoy a couple of drinks together, themed even. Caleb, I'm curious to hear where you went with this. This one was a little less of a known show, so there weren't a lot of pre-made drinks that were themed specifically for the show. So I'm really curious to see how did you approach this? Where'd you go on this?
Okay, so one of the visuals that struck me throughout Paper Girls was the pink lightning. It struck you too, Mark. Of course. I mean, it's a vibrant color, and so I thought, well, I'm going to have a pink lightning, and my version of a pink lightning is I've got a spiked pink lemonade. So it's summer here, so it's a pink lemonade, just with a shot of vodka in it. So my pink lightning. Okay, what did you pink? Yeah.
We had the same idea. We had this. There's these scenes where there's pink light. There's also this eerie kind of iridescent pink purple sky. And since there weren't any really pre-made drinks, I decided that I wanted to create the Paper Girl cocktail. And so I wanted to recreate that sky, that pinkish purple sky. So what I did was I took a Cosmopolitan, but instead of using just cranberry, I actually used a pomegranate blueberry juice to get that color. So tell me, do you think, did I get this pink glowing neon?
That's pretty good. I like that.
There we go.
Yeah.
There we go. So I'm calling it the Paper Girl cocktail. So cheers.
Cheers to you.
Based on our drinks alone, I'm sure we're going to have a great show.
We're going to have a lot of fun.
All right. Well, let's hit the drop and we'll be right back.
Moonshine Jesus. Moonshine Jesus. Moonshine Jesus. Moonshine Jesus, won't you shine a light?
Welcome back to the Moonshine Jesus Show, where today we're talking about the Amazon Prime Video series, Paper Girls. This is, of course, as Mark mentioned, not a spoiler-free zone. Paper Girls is very interesting. Paper Girls takes a foursome of 1980s 12-year-old girls from a suburb of Cleveland and sends them on a time-traveling adventure where they discover themselves, figuratively, as they come to terms with who they are, and literally as they meet future versions of themselves. So they're caught between two warring factions of time travelers: the Old Watch, who believes that everything has been determined and should unfold the way that it already has unfolded, and the STF Underground, which wants to change the past to theoretically make life better for everyone. Now, Mark and I were talking right before the show about how this has been compared to Stranger Things, and there are a lot of parallels, but the cast is a bit more diverse. We've got a Jewish girl who's coming to terms with her sexuality. We've got a black girl, a Chinese girl whose mother is an immigrant, and kind of a tomboy. And so it's an interesting cast of characters. Mark, I'd like to hear a little bit about what you think about the show and how you think it compares to Stranger Things.
Well, I think first of all, just I wish people. I get why people are comparing it to Stranger
Sure.
Things. I mean, you've got four teenagers start at the first episode. They're on their bikes, and they get thrown into this kind of mysterious, unexpected, supernatural almost
Mhm.
type of setting where they have to figure out
Sure.
what to do. But beyond that, there really just isn't any. I mean, the '80s, yeah, but even with the '80s, like in Stranger Things, you have this sort of idealized version of what the '80s were. Everything's bright
Mhm.
and beautiful, and this is very gritty and real, and just what life looks like. And I
Mm.
kind of like that balance. But beyond that, there's just no comparison. I mean, um, Stranger Things is a vehicle to launch into the upside down and to do some frightening kind of interactive stuff. And the exact opposite is true of Paper
Mm.
Girl. Paper Girls is the sci-fi element of it is just interesting storytelling, but
Mhm.
it's the backside of what the show's about. A matter of fact, it's kind of the excuse to let them travel in time and see their future selves, because a lot of the struggle that goes in on this is I think at least the show itself is partly about um, childhood expectations versus adulthood realities, and either unrealized goals or unrealistic goals, and how that
Yeah.
causes internal struggle. And having four girls who are very different from each other, unlike the four uh, members of the D&D team from Stranger Things, who were more similar than disalike ultimately.
Mhm.
And to watch them have to build relationships and do internal struggles and deal with their future selves and what their expectations were, I think is just a much more brilliant concept. And frankly, it's based on a comic book that was written long before Stranger Things came along.
Yeah, absolutely, and I do think that it's interesting. I hope it's the reason I would hold on to a comparison is I'm hopeful that it's reflective of some of the things that Hollywood has been learning.
Mm,
And that's that a strong female cast that is
right.
diverse can still lead to a successful show. That we don't have to have
Massively.
four white boys to have a
Right.
successful show, right?
Right.
And I think the putting these girls in the center and
I love
kind
it.
of seeing their life experience is incredible. And I loved kind of the coming of age grappling that
Mhm.
they were doing as well,
Absolutely.
in a way that you don't always see as
Right.
we deal
I
with them, like
right.
traveling in time and getting their first
Right.
period and trying
Right.
to deal with
And it was
that.
great though. Part of that meant that they also weren't around any adults, which I
Right.
thought was I thought that's kind of the interesting
Hmm.
theme here, is this relationship with adults in general,
Hmm.
because this is sort of a show about preteens made for
Hmm.
adults.
Yeah.
Whereas Stranger Things is a show about preteens. It's made for preteens and anyone else who might enjoy a fun kind of good time.
Hmm.
So to watch them kind of leaning on each other when they're very different, and Hollywood really loves to put women against women, particularly
Hmm.
when they put different types of
Yes.
characters. You
Hmm.
get your blue
Hmm.
collar one, you've got your
Hmm.
Tiffany's very highly intelligent.
Right.
KJ has a rich family.
Hmm.
So they're doing all these types that tend to be put up, particularly as teenagers. When we see it in Hollywood, they tend to be pitted against each other. And while we see some tension early on with these girls,
Yeah.
what we ultimately have is them helping each other through these coming of age moments. And it's sort of
Mhm,
a
mhm.
beautiful, more realistic story of what can happen.
And yeah, and a good positive goal for women, because I think that one of the things that Hollywood does do is then through presenting these people clashing, that then
Mhm.
they that also can influence the way that people act, as they see that as normative, and it's really
Yeah.
not, and it doesn't have to be. And I think the strong friendship is pretty cool. Here's something I wondered about, Mark. Okay,
Yeah.
so and I want to get your perspective on this. So throughout the episodes, we've got these two warring factions, right? We've
Right.
got the Old Watch and we've got the STF. And as I
Mhm.
said earlier, Old Watch wants things to unfold as they already
Right.
have. They're in the future, right? And STF is at a future point, even beyond the Old
Mhm.
Watch, and they want to change the course of events. And so throughout this, we're made to kind of sympathize with the STF. We've kind of seen
Right.
things from their perspective. And I want to know, as a Presbyterian, Mark, Did you find the
I
predestination argument of old watch appealing? Where did you find
Yeah.
yourself,
I
or
had
just
a
in general, where'd you find yourself siding on that?
I had a feeling you would go there, frankly. Yeah, I mean, so ultimately, predestination in Presbyterianism is a little overplayed in the outside world of what predestination really is thought of. But let's just take the that question, because I think there were
Yeah.
some interesting answers to that question that they
Mhm.
present. It's one of the fun things about this, even as they're dealing with, and I think the core of this movie is the four girls and their relationship and their
Mhm.
coming of age, and they're dealing with expectations versus reality in terms of growing up. I think that's the core, but there are these fun little side things that go on in time travel, and what is predestined and what isn't is
Mhm.
definitely part of it. And there's this moment where the adult version of Tiffany talks about a predestination paradox, where they've kind of got caught in this time loop and there's no way to break out of it, and you're kind of stuck in it. And it's so in some ways that's you're predestined. But I love part of the conversation that comes out of it, because grandfather, who is this really fun character played by Jason
Mhm.
Mantzoukas, who's a stand-up comedian who's really good in a lot of stuff, but
Yeah.
fantastic in this.
He's
So the girl,
fantastic. Yeah.
actually,
Right.
the casting of this is so brilliant.
It's
Everybody is
wonderful. It's
so good.
incredible. Yeah.
But he says, well, everything happens for a reason. And one of the girls says, well, people say that to kind of absolve themselves from
Right.
responsibility.
Right.
I love that.
Yeah.
But then, and I don't remember which girl it was that said it was probably KJ. It might have been Aaron, but says,
Mhm.
uh, we all make choices. If we can
Yeah.
stop bad things from happening, you have to try. So the grandfather was all
Mhm.
like, well, just lay back because things are predestined and there's nothing you can do. We just
Yeah.
got to keep it like it is. And I love this line of, look, bad things happen. If something bad
Yeah.
happens, aren't we supposed to try to make things better? And so
Yeah.
for me, I don't know. Are things predestined? I really certainly don't think so. I watch too
Mhm.
many things be shaped with our actions, and it'd be easy enough to say, "Well, our actions were whatever."
Yeah.
I like much better the concept and the thought that who we are today
Yeah.
and the way we interact in the world can change the future for a better future. The other predestination is so hopeless, and I want some hope. I want some hope.
I'm with you, Mark. Except that I'm with you about that in our everyday lives. But in this show, I kind of found myself uh, siding with the old watch. I thought,
Oh yeah,
these girls have only heard things from this one perspective of these people they don't even know, and
right.
it seems to me dangerous to go meddling about in the past and hoping that you can shape the future, hoping that whatever you do is going to somehow change the future for the better without really knowing what kind of consequences that's really going to have. And so I found
But
myself throughout sympathizing, saying,
right.
I think the old watch
Here's the
got a
thing,
point.
though. If you got a time machine, like they work off of a theory of time where there's only one timeline, and you jump
Mhm,
back in time and you're recreating the future timeline. You're not creating any spin-off
mhm.
timelines. And look, um, I think that if that is the case, then yeah, you should always try to change it and just keep doing it until you get the right future timeline. I mean, you got the technology. Why would you not do that?
But the right future timeline for who? There are billions of people in the world, and
For
we
the
have
most
no
people, for the
idea.
most people, for the most people, the right timeline for the most people,
Okay, so
a
you're
timeline
an
that's less
STF
about.
underground guy, and
I am to a degree. I do feel
yeah,
like they play kind of fast and loose with the timeline. It's like they just
yeah,
pick one event that they personally are kind of upset about, and they're like, "Oh, we're going to go change that, so this will be better for us." And so that's to your point. I don't think that they're taking the higher worldly good necessarily. Although I'm beginning to wonder if we get a next season, if we might see that that actually is for a higher worldly good. And we can get to that a little bit later, why I think that. But I want to give a shout out to Ellen Green, who's watching online, because I think she put it perfectly when it comes to that everything happens for a reason line from Grandfather. She says everything happens for a reason is pure bullshit, isn't it? And it really is. I hate that line. It's one of the worst things I've ever heard in terms of the way it impacts people negatively and hurts people. And we hear it all the time being tied, particularly to Christianity, that somehow that there's this God that's creating even horrible things that are meant for good. I absolutely hate that. But I don't have any sympathy. You're right. I don't have much sympathy for the watch, although I really loved Grandfather's explanation, his mixtape explanation for the reason why he doesn't like the changes in time, the degradation and everything. That was really kind of a nice.
It really was, and I think he convinced me. And as we're still talking about the everything happens for a reason thing, a resource I'd give folks is Kate Bowler's "Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved." That is a great thing about her cancer diagnosis and how that is not from God. The other question I have, Mark, related to this, I want to really get your opinion about this. So this is still about the old watch. Okay. Do you think the girls had a switch in how they viewed STF and the old watch in the final scenes of the movie, as the prioress was kind of taking them kind of, or you think they're still STF?
I don't think they did, because of something the prioress herself said. While she's having this change of heart, she goes, "I believe the future can be what we make it." And that hit home, and it goes to what I was saying earlier of that hope that I need. She said that to the girls, and I think that's part of why they were so on board to go and try to change things. Where Prioress decided, "I'm going to send you somewhere where you can make a difference and change all this horrible history that's going on that I'm trying to protect ultimately because of a job I fell into. I'm going to send you in a place where you maybe not only can change the future of Mac, who's dying from cancer. We're going to send you a place where you might be able to do something about that. But maybe you can talk with Tiffany, your older Tiffany, and do something about this time travel that has ultimately caused a future that there's at least some members of the STF believes needs to be changed desperately." So I don't think that I think when Grandfather made the argument with the mixtape, I think they kind of were like, "Oh, okay, that makes some sense." Like degradation every time you record over the timeline, how that weakens the timeline, how it unravels the timeline, how it ultimately snaps the timeline using a cassette tape and popping the actual track on it. I think that they may have been convinced then, but I think that line from the prioress about that the future can be what we make it kept them more in the pocket of the STF. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, see, I think she's ultimately being a really good old watch person by breaking the rules here, because by prohibiting the creation of time travel, she ensures that there will be nothing that will happen in the timeline. That's my guess on it. I think we're going to see. I think we're going to see that maybe the old watch isn't as bad as we think. But you know what, Mark? We have there's a lot of fun stuff to talk about.
Absolutely.
But as we've already hinted at a few times, it's also a very deep show, and it's got a lot of real issues that we can dig into. So let's take a quick break, and let's come back and let's talk about the theology and the politics of Paper Girls.
Hello and welcome back to the Moonshine Jesus Show. You're joining us right now for our Theopolitico segment. And as Caleb mentioned just before the break, there is a lot of deep things going on beyond time travel in this show. And some of them are almost unexpected. I didn't realize that we were going to be dealing with some of the issues. And some of them lean a little more philosophical, which I always think philosophical stuff and theological stuff are cousins at the very least, and if not closer. So I want to start with a question that came to me. It just kind of hit me as something was happening. I think it's from the last episode. It's either the last or the penultimate episode. Larry, who is a STF guy played by Nate Cordry, who I found him brilliant on the Jon Stewart show, on the Daily Show with Jon Stewart. But he has become quite the actor. And this role wasn't even in the comic books. They made it and put it into this show, and I thought he was brilliant in the role. I love the way he was struggling with moments. He has to be partly strong STF guy who this is what the right thing is, what we're doing, and is recording all of the moments where you can time jump. And but at the same time, you can tell he's a little uncertain of himself and a little bit confused at time, and just kind of standing around and staring at things. Although he's building this giant monster robot that can travel in time, which, by the way, I never quite understood why it needed to be a monster robot that could travel in time. That felt a little like story-wise. I was like, yeah, but why? But why? It was fun though. It was fun because we got to see Ellie Wong as the older Aaron trying to control it, and she's just a great comedic actress, and she pulled it off so well. But anyway, so Larry talks about to the girls. He's like, "You're not going to quite understand this yet, but I can't go with you. I've got to stay here and take care of my Meemaw. And you're not going to understand that yet. You're not going to understand that yet, but it's a responsibility I have." But then he comes out later with a shotgun as the girls are being held by the watch, and we didn't even get to this part, and the pterodactyl is staring down at them.
How did we not get to the pterodactyl?
Talk about the dinosaurs in the time travel movie about kids from the 80s. I don't know how we didn't get there. But anyway, so he's trying to save them, but he's standing down a massive pterodactyl, probably a pterodactyl bigger than an actual pterodactyl. I mean, it was just crazy how big that thing was. And he ultimately loses his life. So here's my question. Do we have a responsibility to work for the higher good, even if it risks the things that are a personal good to us? Because that is what he did.
I think so. I think generally, yes, the good of the many outweigh the good of the few or the one, right? So that's Star Trek talking through there. I think that's right generally. Although, I think that it's a balance, because we can also use that sometimes as an excuse to neglect the people who are most important to us, or even to neglect the care of ourselves. And so sometimes we can say what I'm doing is so important that you devote so much time and energy to that it can be done at the expense of others. And so I think about this too in terms of people who do some really significant social change. Right? They devote their entire lives to social change. And almost always the people who really affect a whole lot of societal change do so at the expense of their own health and well-being, and the expense of the health and well-being of those around them. I mean, a lot of folks, die early in the struggle because they're not they're not caring for themselves. And so I think, or
even challenging. If they're challenging something, sometimes other people will take their life, and they know that they're kind of like Larry did. He's challenging someone. He knew he was putting his life out there. And please continue.
Yes.
I was just going to add that part.
Yeah, I think you're right. So I mean, sure, there are dramatic examples where people are, maybe have a life or death situation, like Larry did in this case. But I think the more common example is like for those of us who are committed to working to justice work, how do we, or working for justice in the world, how do we balance that with also being able to sustain that work a long time, and I do think it's a balance. I don't know. What do you think? Do you have some
Well,
insight?
I definitely struggle with that. I'll go back to I think it was KJ's quote that said, I think if you can stop bad things from happening, you have to try.
Mm,
And I wonder if there isn't a, a meter on that. That the worse
mm,
the bad thing
mm,
is, the more you should try. And I don't necessarily know that. I think the opposite sometimes happens from what you're saying. You're saying that
mm,
sometimes people will use the big thing
mm,
to not do the smaller important things.
mm,
I think far too frequently, maybe even more frequently,
mm,
we use the smaller important things to argue why we can't do the big important things. And that can lead to some really bad places in society when so many
mm,
of us are willing to settle on all the little small victories of things that are important and say, well, these are important, and I can't risk not being able to do these in order to address these larger goods. And it goes back to what you said. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, and maybe I think to a degree that's true even personally. The
mm,
needs of the many outweigh the needs of the smaller good.
mm, mm.
But it's very difficult because you do feel like ultimately you're making I think there's nothing wrong with choosing to sacrifice yourself, frankly.
Mm.
I really don't. I think
Yeah.
that if you believe so strongly in a larger, greater good and you're willing to risk yourself and your own life and your own health or whatever, that's your choice. And I don't have a problem with that. Matter of
Yeah.
fact, I think that there is something um, positive about that, and it speaks well of folks who know what they're sacrificing.
Yeah.
Choosing to sacrifice someone else
Yeah.
in that pursuit is a much more difficult place
Mm,
for me to go.
mm.
I
Yeah.
mean, and so there is this weird balance that you have to figure out. In his case, he all but chose to completely sacrifice anyone taking care of Meemaw because he was
Yeah.
it. There was nobody else left for Meemaw.
Right.
Although I really liked the brief we saw of Meemaw. She was a fun character, like
She
laughing
was.
at, I really like your friends. It was great. Um, but there was, and I don't know if that's
Yeah.
it's just the storytelling, the narrative that went on that
Yeah.
was necessary to make him a somewhat of a heroic figure. But in order for him to be the heroic figure, he does sacrifice Meemaw ultimately.
And
Um,
but does he accomplish anything, Mark? I mean, is anything accomplished by his sacrifice?
well,
I don't this.
I think the answer to that's twofold. I
Yeah.
think one, it ultimately could have meant something. Like
Yeah.
that sacrifice could have. You never know when you're standing up for something, a larger social good, a larger good than yourself, whether or not you're going to be successful and whether or not you're going to have to make this. The point is, could you make a difference? And if you could, then as KJ, I think, or Aaron said, you have to try. If you can do something positive, you've got to try. And that's what he ultimately did. He ultimately understood her message and he decided he has to try. Did he really? Um, I don't think he did what he wanted to,
Yeah.
but that does feel like one of the moments where the girls start really coming together.
Hmm.
There was this person that they barely knew who they already heard say, there's certain things you're not going to understand, and I can't go with you because I've got to be here for my Meemaw.
Yeah.
And then he steps out and he makes this courageous sacrifice in order to try to protect them. And that is about the point in the storyline where we start seeing them get even closer knit. And it's not short after that we see them all standing hand in hand, united, and they stay that way for the rest of the episode. So,
Hmm.
um, I mean, I think
Maybe.
so.
Yeah.
I think so. My bigger thing is just that I think too frequently we let the smaller goods outweigh. We let it be an excuse to not work on the larger pot good. And I think folks who don't want the larger good
Yeah.
to happen sometimes count on us doing that.
I think an interesting point that's related to this is the idea of redemptive suffering, Mark. And I'm interested
Mhm.
on your take on this, right? Because that was a big part of Martin Luther King Jr.'s theology, right? Was that
Absolutely.
suffering was something that redeemed you and redeemed
Yeah.
you in some way. And so that became a part of his whole philosophy for the
Sure.
civil rights movement,
Absolutely.
right? Was we're going to suffer for this for the
Absolutely.
good of everyone else. And the
Mhm.
suffering is what is
Right.
going to redeem. And a lot of people have had problems with that,
Yeah.
and
Well,
and especially Black theologians now that have said,
mhm,
actually, it's wrong to
I
call
agree.
on people who are already suffering and don't have a choice
Right.
to have to suffer in order to
Absolutely.
save themselves. What do you
Absolutely.
think of that whole notion of
Well,
redemptive suffering?
one, I don't necessarily agree that it's wrong to call on people who are already suffering to redeem themselves. I don't think it's wrong to call on them to work for a greater good and it might cause suffering. My issue is with it. The suffering is somehow pre-installed with redemption.
Hmm.
Suffering is suffering. Suffering
Mm,
hurts. Suffering's
mm,
bullshit. It hurts. It's
mm,
bad. It's not. Suffering itself is not redeemable. Suffering will always remain horrible.
mm,
What can happen though is suffering can give a ground if you choose to learn from and to create, so weave something redemptive out of it. But the suffering itself was never redemptive. It was
mm,
just a space that was necessary to work for the greater good. And from it, you can choose to wallow in the suffering, or you can choose to recognize it as suffering and figure out, how do I make something good from this? How do I find the moments of learning, the moments of realization in it, and create a better future because of it, leaving it to be just as horrible it was to begin with.
mm, mm, mm. Well, that's very interesting. And see, who would have thought that a show about girls time
Right,
traveling in the '80s would
right.
would lead to like, wait, should wait? Is suffering good? Is it necessary for the
Right,
betterment of others? What about redemptive suffering? So this
right.
show this
It is
show
interesting.
is not only
Right.
incredibly entertaining, but it's very deep.
It absolutely is. And I'm going to stretch the segment just a little bit longer because I got one more funny but
Okay.
insightful thing about the show. Like I said, I really appreciated Grandfather. He feels so out of place in the entire show, but kind of perfectly in place at the same time.
Yeah.
I love that he is all about keeping things in order and
Mhm.
not having any. But he is this massive fan of Metallica and Public Enemy.
Yeah.
Like, do you think do you think that he gets how ironic that is? Is he doing it because of the irony, or does he not get it? Because the reason I ask is actually politically motivated. The
Mhm.
number of folks in this world that watch science fiction stuff or listen to Public Enemy, or
Yeah.
any kind of
Yeah, yeah.
resistant kind of art, and still toe the line of very conservative,
Yeah. Hmm.
not accepting. I mean, why does that happen? I mean, why are we so willing from an art standpoint, deal with a very progressive idea and has really challenged the structure kind of understanding of the world, but fall back into a life that's so completely in line with all of that?
I
What
think
do
in
you think?
his case, it was he screamed irony throughout in
I think,
the
yeah, I
yeah,
think he
and so
was too.
I think he was comedic about it, and I think he was wearing it for that reason. I think in public life, though, I think a lot of the things that people have come to love and kind of feel safe were things that really did push the boundary when they were released, and now have
Mm,
become so much a part of culture that people don't see them as dangerous
right?
anymore. Like, it's
Yeah.
just like, oh well, that's part of that's
It's kind of
whatever.
like, yeah,
Lost
it's
its
kind of
edge.
like you and I are planning a future show on The Boys.
Yeah, right.
And it's kind of interesting to have watched. There have been a lot of conservative folks
Yeah.
who are watching it, and the
Uh-huh.
lead character of The Boys is kind of the
Mm,
superhero character.
right.
But as the show goes on, spoiler alert.
Yeah.
As the show goes on, we learn that he's a jerk. He's
It's
horrible.
terrible. Yeah.
But these conservative folks, up until that happens, we're looking at him as a real hero. And then they got really, really mad when he ends up being the bad guy.
It's a look at yourself kind of moment.
Right? It really,
it's you can't plan it much. You can't plan it much better than that. Then get people on board, say this is our guy, then show him to be a terrible person. Be like, yeah, this is your guy. You're right about that.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Well, okay. Like we said, it's a deep show. We could go on and on. We really encourage you to watch it. I think it'll bring up lots of questions for you. But it's time for us to end this segment because we need to move on, because our favorite time of each episode is when we get to try to make our co-host look stupid. And that is up after the break.
Welcome back to the Moonshine Jesus Show, where we are moving into our Make Me Look Stupid segment, where we try to make each other look stupid. We each get a question to ask the other. And Mark, I've got a question for you, but I got to tell you, it's not so much that I'm going to try and make you look stupid today. I want to know your perspective on this, and we didn't have a chance to talk about it.
Okay, all right, fair enough.
There's a lot of stuff here, and one of the things that we didn't mention, but I think is one of the most interesting parts of the show is KJ. And this is the Jewish girl who is coming to terms with her sexuality. And so this I know you don't want to draw parallels to Stranger Things, but I'm still going to a little bit, because one of the criticisms of Stranger Things, especially over the last couple of seasons, has been that they haven't really been willing to deal with sexuality in a way explicitly in the way that a lot of people want. And here, right up in this first season, they deal with KJ's sexuality, and she gets to encounter a future version of herself, and she meets her girlfriend, and then she sees her future self like embrace the girlfriend, right? And you see both on her face this look of horror and maybe this look of like understanding, like realization. I'm curious to hear your perspective. How do you think they did on LGBT issues? I
actually think they did really well, and actually I think both shows did. I think they just do it from a different perspective. Part of what we get from Stranger Things is a story being told from a child's perspective, from a kid's perspective, and so it kind of makes sense to me that what we get with them dealing with someone who's outside of the expected binary sexual kind of expectations. Is a kid who's struggling to recognize and completely understand who he is himself and express it to other people. And I think the way they shoot it and tell the story helps you feel that tension a little bit. So I don't have a real problem, a massive problem with how Stranger Things does it at all, really. I think I like the way that Paper Girls does it better, though, because it's so very real, particularly at this age. You got to remember, again, kids of the 80s, you have social expectations about who you are sexually, and you see her struggling with that internally, recognizing it, but you can also see her be completely fascinated with the girlfriend, how she shows up to the movies and has this long conversation with her older self's girlfriend. Like there's this kind of warm, special moment where you realize that she's really like getting how good this is for her. Like this is who, when she's having that conversation, it's one of the times I see her being less shy and less introverted and being more engaged. And so there's something special about the way they present that relationship. But at the same time, I love it's not overly simplified. They come back, and near the end of the last episode, she and Max start getting close, and they're in the barn, And Mac is trying to warm up to her, which is out of Mac's character,
Right.
blue
Right.
collar, rough and tumble tomboy, like
Yeah.
screw the world. I'm just going to be me, and y'all can deal
Yeah.
with it. But she puts her hand on KJ's hand
Yeah.
in a very tender moment. I thought it was
Right.
lovely. And KJ has this immediate gut reaction of pulling back.
Yeah.
And that hurts. That ends up hurting Mac. And I kind of love that they explored this space of Mac's, this tough kid who's trying to open up and maybe understand her own sexuality. We don't really know at that point. But KJ's reaction based on the way society has taught her and pushed in these unreal understandings of binary sexuality pulls back. And you can tell has some remorse about it. So I really like that. I feel like they handle it in a mature way. And it kind of goes back. I think Stranger Things is told more from a kid's perspective, and Paper Girls is told more from from a perspective that's meant to appeal to adults who remember what their childhood was like. I don't know. I mean, what do you think?
I thought they handled it really well for those reasons. There, you got to really see some of the complexity, and you got to see the realizations here and the struggle with relationships. And I just love the scene that I was referencing just a minute ago. She's the young KJ is hiding out in the bathroom in her house, and she sees her future self, go and kiss her girlfriend.
Right.
And this is a point in life where you're trying to figure out a lot of times sexuality and figure out what all that means. And I thought this was a real testament to how good the actress was to see in her face, like both horror and then and to see her eyes kind of settle. And you could almost see the processing in her head, maybe this is who I am. And so that wasn't really something that I ever had to struggle with. My sexuality wasn't something that was ever in question for me. And so I loved being able to see it in this way, to see someone, come to terms with that. So I agree with you, buddy. Yeah. What have you got for me? You got a question for me?
All right, here's my question for you. And actually, we're already over time, and we're just going to go over time, frankly, because I've got a series of questions, and they're not really.
Of course you did. I've got five questions for you.
No. I usually let you pick. These aren't really stumper questions. This kind of goes back to, these are things I'm very curious about, and I'm really interested in your perspective. And your answer to each is going to lead to another kind of curiosity. So we end the episode with Tiffany and Aaron going back, traveling in time in one pod, and Mac and KJ traveling in time in another pod, right?
Yeah.
So my first question to you is, what year did Tiffany and Aaron go back to? They go back.
They're Tiffany and Aaron go. They're the ones who go back. They go back in time. That? Yeah. Right. And so they go back in time. I think it's the 1970s, because they go. They're walking through the forest, and they see a drive-in movie theater with dated cars. They're watching Longest Yard. So I think that was released.
David Bowie's playing in the background, I think.
And that song I think was released in 75. So you've got so it's we're talking mid 70s here, probably 75-ish. Yeah.
So what? How stuck are they, man? I mean, seriously, Larry's maybe a kid at that point. I don't know. I mean,
and they don't. That's true, and they don't have the journal. Here's what I think is going to happen.
This was my immediate. I had so much anxiety the moment I realized where they were. I was like, "Holy crap! They got nobody to go to. They don't have their older selves. They don't have Larry. All they have is Tiffany, who the black girl, who is brilliant." Yeah. Brilliant mind, and has been exposed to some stuff that she wouldn't have been in the 80s.
Right.
But would she have the equipment in the mid-70s? I don't know, man.
So I think the way that the next season is going to play out is we're going to get part of the season, maybe half, with exploring the different timelines and what's happening. Yeah. Then that perhaps the ones who are in the future, right? Because we know that the prioress was sending them to the future right? That's where the
Right.
pod was supposed to go to try and stop Tiffany's future self from inventing time travel. They'll have more access to time travel. I think they'll go back and get them.
You think they'll go find the others?
I think.
All right, so
Yeah. Okay.
So here's my last question,
Yeah.
and it refers to something that we talked about in the first segment, and I said we'll get to that.
Okay.
Why did they get there and go, I expected to see flying cars?
Oh, but yeah. Well, I think it's because they thought they were going to they thought that the prioress was sending them to the future, just like she had sent the others. But she's like dying, and so I think it was an accident.
I thought that was Mac and KJ who said, I expected to see flying cars. We don't see much of where they end up, but I think Mac says I expected to. No, one of them says I expected to see flying cars.
I thought that was the ones who were in the 70s, who they land in the field and they walk through the field and they go through the field.
Maybe so. There was something that was said that made me think that maybe they weren't where they like. I guess my ultimate thing was I felt like they end up in a future that's dystopian.
Well, okay.
Which would be a reason why you would go back and try to, like, for the greater good, the STF, if they end up in a dystopian future, the STF would definitely, why would you not go back as many times as it takes to try to change things so that you don't end up in that dystopian future? I don't know.
We're going to have to see. But you know what? Either way, Mark,
Yeah.
I am 100% on board for Paper Girls season 2. I'm there.
I have to say, there's 8 episodes in this season. I was sharing with you before the show started in our pre-show discussion. I was like, man, I sat down thinking I was going to watch 2 shows a night for the week leading up to this. I watched the first 6 episodes and I only stopped because it was midnight. And I was like, I got to go to bed. I got to go to work in the morning. I mean, it is that good of a show. I think the first episode or 2 are a little slow, but they tease enough stuff and the acting is so incredible. It's more than worth it. But yeah, it's a great show, man. And I'm into, I don't know that it's actually been renewed for a second season yet.
They better.
I agree. The last episode very clearly ramps it up to encourage us to want a second season. And I think it's going to be popular enough. I hope it's going to be popular enough that that Amazon will sink a bigger budget into it, because there were moments that were a little underdone from the CGI and that kind of stuff.
Agreed. And I think, and they certainly set it up because they did change the ending from the comic book, from the way it ended in the comic book to, I think, set up for a second season. So the interesting thing is the comic book only has 30 comics. Yeah. And so there's only so much story in the comic books for them to cover. Right. So it's going to be
They've covered a decent amount of it right now. Yeah. The comic book writer and graphic designer have been involved heavily in producing this, so that they would have a good influence. So even if we end up having to go past the comic book, we probably end up with great story because they're involved in it. But it's great, and I think we both would say if you haven't watched it, go watch it. You will be so happy. These four young actresses, keep an eye on them. They're going to blow up. They are. It's ridiculous at somewhere around the age of 12 that you can convey the emotion without words that they do. It is exceptional.
Agreed. 100%. So this has been a lot of fun talking about Paper Girls. So, but you know what? We're going to have to wrap it, Mark. We're going to have to wrap it up, and we're going to have to look to next week. And
next week. Yep.
And
I'm excited.
You want to tell them? You want to tell them what we're gonna talk about?
You're okay. Are you okay with me telling them?
Yeah, I want you to tell them, Mark. I want you to reveal this.
Okay. So this one actually sort of hits close to home for me because it's a comic book that I've been very attracted to. Because when I was in basketball camp, a college player gave me the nickname of Sandman, and so it's been a phrase that I've carried with me and a nickname that I've carried with me from Sandlin to Sandman. But so there is a DC comic book called The Sandman, and it brings the story of Morpheus, the king of drinks, to life. And so they have just released it to Netflix. and it's got amazing stars in it. And it's basically about a character after being a victim of an occult ritual and held captive for 106 years. This character, Morpheus, finally escapes and goes on a mission to help restore order to his kingdom. It is all of the early reviews seem to say it's incredibly and well produced and well directed. So I'm real excited about this. So that's going to be our next show, and everyone should make sure they watch so they can really dig into the conversation with us.
That's right. And we're going to do something unprecedented today.
Yeah.
We told
Yes.
you about next week. We're going to also tell you what we're doing 2 weeks from now. So this is a big thing for us, Mark.
We hinted at this a little bit.
Yeah, we never
at this
looked
a little
before.
bit.
Yeah, we hinted.
No, we don't.
Okay. 2 weeks from now, we're gonna
Right.
watch The Boys, which flips the superhero narrative on its head. It's a lot of fun, but there are 3 seasons, so we thought we want to give you time to watch The Boys. It's on Amazon Prime, but if you haven't seen it, really interesting. A lot
Not
of
for the
fun.
faint of heart.
Not for the faint of heart. There's a lot of
graphic.
violence and nudity and language, but
what they
if that
deal
didn't bother
with and
you, a
grapple
great
with.
show.
Yeah. And what they grapple with and deal with is going to be great fodder for discussion. It is amazing
Absolutely.
what they do in that show. Yeah.
Well, Mark, we've had a wonderful show today. Thanks to everybody for joining us. We appreciate you being here with us today and maybe drinking some pink drinks with us. That was
Right.
fun. We'll see you next time on the Moonshine Jesus Show.
Moonshine Jesus.